Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. Chapter 21. Appearance of Jumping Bear. I prevail on him to carry a letter to the fort. A war speech. Intended treachery. Resume our journey to the fort. Singular meeting with a white man. Has Richmond fallen? Arrival at the fort. I am free. Jumping Bear, who rescued me from the revengeful arrow of the Indian whose horse the thief shot, one day presented himself to me, and reminded me of my indebtedness to him in thus preserving my life. Trembling with fear, I listened to his avowal of more than ordinary feeling, during which he assured me that I had no cause to fear him, that he had always liked the white woman, and would be more than a friend to me. I replied that I did not fear him, that I felt grateful to him for his kindness and protection, but that unless he proved his friendship for me, no persuasion could induce me to listen. "Will you carry a letter to my people at the fort, delivering it into the hands of the great chief there? They will reward you for your kindness to their sister, they will give you many presents, and you will return rich." "I dare not go," he replied, "nor could I get back before the warriors came to our village." "My people will give you a fast horse," said I, "and you may return speedily. Now go and prove your friendship by taking the letter, and returning with your prizes." I assured him that the letter contained nothing that would harm him or his people; that I had written of him and his kindness, and of his good will toward them. After many and long interviews, the women of the lodge using their influence, I at last prevailed upon him to go, and invoking the bright moon as a witness to my pledge of honor and truth, he started on his journey, bearing the letter which I believed was to seal my fate for weal or woe. In the moonlight I watched his retreating form, imploring Heaven to grant the safe delivery of the little messenger upon which so much depended. Daring and venturesome deed! Should he prove false to me, and allow any one outside the fort to see the letter, my doom was inevitable. Many days of intense anxiety were passed after his departure. The squaws, fearing I had done wrong in sending him, were continually asking questions, and it was with difficulty I could allay their anxiety, and prevent them from disclosing the secret to the other women. The contents of the letter were a warning to the big chief and the soldiers of an intended attack on the fort and the massacre of the garrison, using me as a ruse to enable them to get inside the fort, and beseeching them to rescue me if possible. The messenger reached the fort, and was received by the officer of the day, Lieutenant Hesselberger, and conducted to the commander of the post, Major House, and Adjutant Pell, who had been left there to treat with the Indians on my account. [Footnote: A written statement from Lieutenant Hesselberger, setting forth the fact of my writing and sending the letter of warning, and that it undoubtedly was the means of saving the garrison at Fort Sully from massacre, is on file in the Treasury Department at Washington. A certified copy is published in connection with this narrative.] General Sully was absent at Washington, but every necessary precaution was taken to secure the fort. Jumping Bear received a suit of clothes and some presents, and was sent back with a letter for me, which I never received, as I never saw him again. These facts I learned after my arrival at Fort Sully. The night before our departure from the Blackfeet village, en route for the fort, I was lying awake, and heard the chief address his men seriously upon the subject of their wrongs at the hands of the whites. I now understood and spoke the Indian tongue readily, and so comprehended his speech, which, as near as I can recollect, was as follows: "Friends and sons, listen to my words. You are a great and powerful band of our people. The inferior race, who have encroached on our rights and territories, justly deserve hatred and destruction. These intruders came among us, and we took them by the hand. We believed them to be friends and true speakers. They have shown us how false and cruel they can be. They build forts to live in and shoot from with their big guns. Our people fall before them. Our game is chased from the hills. Our women are taken from us, or one to forsake our lodges, and wronged and deceived. It has only been 4 or 5 moons since they drove us to desperation, killed our brothers and burned our teepees. The Indian cries for vengeance. There is no truth nor friendship in the white man. Deceit and bitterness are in his words. Meet them with equal cunning. Show them no mercy. They are but few, we are many. Whet your knives and string your bows, sharpen the tomahawk and load the rifle. Let the wretches die who have stolen our lands, and we will be free to roam over the soil that was our fathers'. We will come home bravely from battle. Our songs shall rise among the hills, and every tepee shall be hung with the scalp locks of our foes." This declaration of hostilities was received with grunts of approval, and silently the war preparations went on, that I might not know the evil design hidden beneath the mask of friendship. That night, as if in preparation for the work he had planned, the gracious chief beat his poor tired squaw unmercifully, because she murmured at her never-ending labor and heavy tasks. His deportment to me was as courteous as though he had been educated in civilized life. Indeed, had he not betrayed so much ignorance of the extent and power of the American nation, in his address to his band, I should have thought him an educated Indian, who had traveled among the whites. Yet in his brutal treatment of his squaw, his savage nature asserted itself, and reminded me that, although better served than formerly, I was still among savages. When morning came to my sleepless night, I arose, still dreading lest some terrible intervention should come between me and the longed-for journey to the abodes of white men. The day before leaving the Blackfeet village, I gave all my Indian trinkets to a little girl who had been my constant companion, and by her gentle and affectionate interest in the captive white woman, had created within me a feeling akin to love. She was half white, and was granddaughter of a chief called Wichinkiapa, who also treated me with kindness. The morning after the chief's address to his warriors, the savages were all ready for the road, and, mounting in haste, set up their farewell chant as they wound in a long column out of the village. I have frequently been asked, since my restoration to civilization, how I dressed while with the Indians, and whether I was clothed as the squaws were. A description of my appearance as I rode out of the Indian village that morning will satisfy curiosity on this point. My dress consisted of a narrow white cotton gown, composed of only 2 breadths, reaching below the knee and fastened at the waist with a red scarf. Moccasins, embroidered with beads and porcupine quills, covered my feet, and a robe over my shoulders completed my wardrobe. While with the Ogalallas, I wore on my arms great brass rings that had been forced on me, some of them fitting so tight that they lacerated my arms severely, leaving scars that I shall ever retain as mementos of my experience in Indian ornamentation. I was also painted as the squaws were, but never voluntarily applied the article. It was winter, and the ground was covered with snow, but so cold was the air that its surface bore the horse's feet on its hard, glittering breast, only breaking through occasionally in the deep gullies. It was 200 miles from the Blackfeet village to Fort Sully, in the middle of winter, and the weather intensely cold, from the effects of which my ill-clad body suffered severely. I was forced to walk a great part of the way, to keep from freezing. Hoping for deliverance, yet dreading lest the treacherous plans of the Indians for the capture of the fort and massacre of its garrison might prove successful, and my return to captivity inevitable, I struggled on, striving to bear with patience the mental and bodily ills from which I suffered. My great fear was that my letter had not fallen into the right hands. On our journey we came in sight of a few lodges, and in among the timber we camped for the night. While in one of the lodges, to my surprise, a gentlemanly figure approached me, dressed in modern style. It astonished me to meet this gentlemanly looking, well-mannered gentleman under such peculiar circumstances. He drew near and addressed me courteously. "This is cold weather for traveling. Do you not find it so?" he inquired. Not when I find myself going in the right direction, I replied. I asked him if he lived in that vicinity, supposing, of course, from the presence of a white man in our camp, that we must be near some fort, trading post, or white settlement. He smiled and said, I am a dweller in the hills, and confess that civilized life has no charms for me. I find in freedom and nature all the elements requisite for happiness. Having been separated from the knowledge and interests of national affairs just when the struggle agitating our country was at its height, I asked the question, Has Richmond been taken? No, nor never will be, was the reply. Further conversation on national affairs convinced me that he was a rank rebel. We held a long conversation on various topics. He informed me he had lived with the Indians 14 years, was born in St. Louis, had an Indian wife and several children, of whom he was very proud, and he seemed to be perfectly satisfied with his mode of living. I was very cautious in my words with him, lest he might prove a traitor, but in our conversation some Indian words escaped my lips, which, being overheard, rumor construed into mischief. What I had said was carried from lodge to lodge, increasing rather than diminishing, until it returned to the lodge where I was. The Indians, losing confidence in me, sent the young men, at midnight, to the camp of the white man, to ascertain what had been said by me, and my feelings toward them. He assured the messengers that I was perfectly friendly, had breathed nothing but kindliness for them, and was thoroughly contented; had so expressed myself, and there was no cause to imagine evil. This man trafficked and traded with the Indians, disposing of his goods in St. Louis and in eastern cities, and was then on his way to his home near the mouth of the Yellowstone River. Early in the forenoon of the last day's travel, my eager and anxious eyes beheld us nearing the fort. The Indians paused and dismounted to arrange their dress and see to the condition of their arms. Their blankets and furs were adjusted, bows were strung, and the guns examined by them carefully. They then divided into squads of 50s, several of these squads remaining in ambush among the hills, for the purpose of intercepting any who might escape the anticipated massacre at the fort. The others then rode on toward the fort, bearing me with them. A painfully startling sight, the last I was destined to see, here met my gaze. One of the warriors, in passing, thrust out his hand to salute me. It was covered by one of my husband's gloves, and the sight of such a memento filled me with inexpressible dread as to his fate. Nothing in the least way connected with him had transpired to throw any light upon his whereabouts, or whether living or dead, since we had been so suddenly and cruelly separated. All was darkness and doubt concerning him. Mr. Kelly had been a Union soldier, and happening to have his discharge papers with me at the time of my capture, I had been able to secrete them ever since, treasuring them merely because they had once belonged to him and contained his name. Now, as we approached the place where his fate would be revealed to me, and, if he lived, we would meet once more, the appearance of that glove, on the savage hand, was like a touch that awakened many chords, some to thrill with hope, some to jar painfully with fear. In appearance I had suffered from my long estrangement from home life. I had been obliged to paint daily, like the rest of my companions, and narrowly escaped tattooing by pretending to faint away every time the implements for the marring operation were applied. During the journey, whenever an opportunity offered, I would use a handful of snow to cleanse my cheeks from savage adornment; and now, as we drew nearer the fort, and I could see the chiefs arranging themselves for effect, my heart beat high, and anticipation became so intense as to be painful. 8 chiefs rode in advance, one leading my horse by the bridle, and the warriors rode in the rear. The cavalcade was imposing. As we neared the fort they raised the war song, loud and wild, on the still, wintry air, and, as if in answer to its notes, the glorious flag of our country was run up, and floated bravely forth on the breeze from the tall flagstaff within the fort. My eyes caught the glad sight, and my heart gave a wild bound of joy. Something seemed to rise in my throat and choke my breathing. Everything was changed. The torture of suspense, the agony of fear, the dread of evil to come, all seemed to melt away like mist before the morning sunshine, when I beheld the precious emblem of liberty. How insignificant and contemptible in comparison were the flaunting Indian flags that had so long been displayed to me, and how my heart thrilled with a sense of safety and protection as I saw the roofs of the buildings within the fort covered by the brave men who composed that little garrison. The precious emblem of liberty, whose beloved stripes and stars floated proudly out, seemed to beckon me to freedom and security, and as the fresh breeze stirred its folds, shining in the morning light, and caused them to wave lightly to and fro, they came like a smile of love and a voice of affection, all combined, to welcome me to home and happiness once more. An Indian hanger-on of the fort had sauntered carelessly forward a few minutes previous, as if actuated by curiosity, but in reality to convey intelligence to his fellow savages of the state of the fort and its defenses. Then the gate was opened, and Major House appeared, accompanied by several officers and an interpreter, and received the chiefs who rode in advance. Meanwhile, Captain Logan, the officer of the day, a man whose kind and sympathetic nature did honor to his years and rank, approached me. My emotions were inexpressible, now that I felt myself so nearly rescued. At last they overcame me. I had borne grief and terror and privation, but the delight of being once more among my people was so overwhelming that I almost lost the power of speech or motion, and when I faintly murmured, "Am I free, indeed free?" Captain Logan's tears answered me as well as his scarcely uttered "yes," for he realized what freedom meant to one who had tasted the bitterness of bondage and despair. As soon as the chiefs who accompanied me entered the gate of the fort, the commandant's voice thundered the order for them to be closed. The Blackfeet were shut out, and I was beyond their power to recapture. After a bondage lasting more than 5 months, during which I had endured every torture, I once more stood free, among people of my own race, all ready to assist me and restore me to my husband's arms. 3 ladies, residing at the fort, received me, and cheerfully bestowed every care and attention which could add to my comfort, and secure my recovery from the fatigues and distresses of my past experience. Chapter 22. Retrospection. A border trading post. Garrison hospitality. A visit from the commandant of Fort Rice. Arrival of my husband. Affecting scene. At first, and some time afterward, at intervals, the effects of my life among the savages preyed upon my mind, so as to injure its quiet harmony. I was ill at ease among my new friends, and they told me that my eyes wore a strangely wild expression, like those of a person constantly in dread of some unknown alarm. Once more free and safe among civilized people, I looked back on the horrible past with feelings that defy description. The thought of leaving this mortal tenement on the desert plain for the wolves to devour and the bones to bleach under the summer sun and winter frosts had been painful indeed. Now I knew that if the weary spirit should leave its earthly home, the body would be cared for by kind Christian friends, and tenderly laid beneath the grass and flowers, and my heart rejoiced therein. Hunger and thirst, long days of privation and suffering, had been mine. No friendly voices cheered me on. All was silence and despair. But now the scene had changed, and the all-wise Being, who is cognizant of every thought, knew the joy and gratitude of my soul. True, during the last few weeks of my captivity, the Indians had done all in their power for me, all their circumstances and condition would allow, and the women were very kind, but their people were not my people, and I was detained a captive, far from home and friends and civilization. With Alexander Selkirk I could say, "Better dwell in the midst of alarms than reign in this horrible place." Being young and possessed of great cheerfulness and elasticity of temper, I was enabled to bear trials which seemed almost impossible for human nature to endure and live. Soon after my arrival at the fort, Captain Pell came and invited me to go to a trader's store to obtain a dress for myself. I needed it very much, having no clothing of my own to wear. A kind lady, Mrs. Davis, accompanied me, and the sight that presented itself to my wondering eyes will never be erased from memory. By the doorsteps, on the porches, and everywhere, were groups of hungry Indians of all sizes, and both sexes, claiming to be friendly. Some of them were covered with every conceivable kind of superficial clothing and adornment, and critically wanting in cleanliness, a peculiar trait among the Indians of the Northwest. There was the papoose, half-breeds of any number, a few absolutely nude, others wrapped slightly in bits of calico, a piece of buckskin, or fur. Speculators, teamsters, and interpreters mingled with the soldiers of the garrison; squaws, with their bright, flashing shawls, or red cloth, receiving in their looped-up blanket the various articles of border traffic, such as sugar, rice, flour, and other things; tall warriors bending over the same counter, purchasing tobacco, brass nails, knives, and glass beads, all giving words to thought, and a stranger might well wonder which was the better prototype of tongues. The Cheyennes supplement their words with active and expressive gestures, while the Sioux amply use their tongues as well as their arms and fingers. To all, whether half-breed, Indian, or white man, the gentlemanly trader gave kind and patient attention, while himself and clerks seemed ready and capable of talking Sioux, French, or English, just as the case came to hand. It was on the 12th of December when I reached the fort, and like heaven the place appeared after the trials of savage life. The officers and men were like brothers to me, and their tender sympathy united me to them in the strongest bonds of friendship, which not even death can sever. A party and supper was made for my special benefit, and on New Year's morning I was serenaded with cannon. Every attention and kindness was bestowed upon me, and to Dr. John Ball, post surgeon, I owe a debt of gratitude which mere words can never express. He was my attendant physician during my sojourn at the fort, and, as my physical system had undergone very severe changes, I needed great care. Under his skillful treatment and patient attention, I soon recovered health and strength. I had been severely frozen on the last days of my journey with the Indians toward the fort. Colonel Diamond, from Fort Rice, came to visit me ere I left Fort Sully. He was attended by an escort of 180 men. He told me of his efforts to obtain my release, and that he, with his men, had searched the Indian village for me, but found no warriors there, as they had already taken me to the fort. The Indian women had made him understand by signs that the white woman had gone with the chiefs. He said the Indians were so enraged about giving me up, that they killed 3 of his men, and scalped them, by orders of the chief Ottawa, who was unable to do any service himself, being a cripple. He bade them bring him the scalps of the white men. An Indian, who had killed one of the men, fell dead in his lodge the same day, which frightened the people not a little; for, in their superstition, they deemed it a visitation of the Great Spirit for a wrong done. Colonel Diamond did not forget me, neither did he cease in his efforts on my behalf. During all this time, no tidings had been received by me of my husband. But one day great commotion was occasioned in the fort by the announcement that the mail ambulance was on the way to the fort, and would reach it in a few moments. An instant after, a soldier approached me, saying, "Mrs. Kelly, I have news for you. Your husband is in the ambulance." No person can have even a faint idea of the uncontrollable emotions which swept over me like an avalanche at that important and startling news. But it was not outwardly displayed. The heartstrings were stirred to their utmost depths, but gave no sound. Trembling, quivering in their strong feeling, they told not of the deep grief and joy intermingled there. Mechanically I moved around, awaiting the presence of the beloved, and was soon folded to his breast, where he held me with a grasp as if fearful of my being torn from him again. Not an eye present but was suffused with tears. Soldiers and men, the ladies who had been friends to me, all mingled their tears and prayers. Language fails to describe our meeting. For 7 long months we had not beheld each other, and the last time was on the terrible field of slaughter and death. His personal appearance, oh, how changed! His face was very pale, and his brown hair was sprinkled with gray. His voice was alone unchanged. He called me by name, and it never sounded so sweet before. His very soul seemed imbued with sadness at our separation, and the terrible events which caused it. My first question was concerning my little Mary, for her fate had been veiled in mystery. He gave me an account of her burial, a sad and heart-rending story sufficient to chill the lightest heart, which account comprises the succeeding chapter. Chapter 23 of Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians by Fanny Kelly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sad Fate of Little Mary. The reader will please go back with me to that fearful first night of my captivity, and to the moment when I put into execution the plan for dear little Mary's escape, which I prayed might result in her restoration to our friends. It must have been something more than a vague hope of liberty to be lost or won that guided the feeble steps of the child back on the trail to a bluff overlooking the road, where, weary from the fatigue and terror of a night passed alone on the prairie, she sat, anxious but hopeful, awaiting the coming of friends. Rescue was seemingly near, now that she had reached the great road, and she knew that there would be a passing train of emigrants ere long. It was in this situation she was seen by some passing soldiers, holding out her little trembling hands with eager joy and hope, imploring them to save her. It was a party of but 3 or 4 soldiers returning from Fort Laramie, where they had been to meet the paymaster. They had been pursued by Indians the day before, had also passed the scene of the destruction of our train, and believed the country swarming with Indians. Their apprehensions were, therefore, fully aroused, and, fearing the little figure upon the distant bluff might be a decoy to lead them into ambush, hesitated to approach. There was a large ravine between, and it is not strange that their imagination should people it with lurking savages. However, they were about crossing to the relief of the little girl, when a party of Indians came in sight, and they became convinced it was a decoy, and turned and fled. They returned to Deer Creek Station, and related the circumstance. Mr. Kelly, arriving soon after, heard it, and his heart sank within him at the description of the child, for he thought he recognized in it the form of our little Mary. He applied to the officer in command for a detail of soldiers to go with him to search for her, but all entreaty and argument were in vain. The agony that poor child endured as the soldiers turned away and the war whoop of the savage rang upon her terrified soul, is known only to God. Instead of the rescue and friends, which in her trusting heart and innocent faith she had expected to find, fierce Indians stood before her, stringing their bows to take her life, thus to win another trophy, marking the Indian murder. The whizzing arrows were sent into the body of the helpless child, and with the twang of the bowstrings, the delicate form of the heroic child lay stretched upon the ground, and the bright angel spirit went home to rest in the bosom of its Father. On the morning of the 14th, 2 days after Mary was seen, Mr. Kelly succeeded in obtaining a squad of soldiers at the station, and went out to search for the child, and after a short march of 8 miles, they discovered the mutilated remains of the murdered girl. Mr. Kelly's grief and anguish knew no bounds. 3 arrows had pierced the body, and the tomahawk and scalping knife had done their work. When discovered, her body lay with its little hands outstretched, as if she had received, while running, the fatal arrows. Surely he who numbers the sparrows and feeds the ravens was not unmindful of her in that awful hour, but allowed the heavenly kingdom, to which her trembling soul was about to take its flight, to sweeten, with a glimpse of its beatific glory, the bitterness of death, even as the martyr Stephen, seeing the bliss above, could not be conscious of the torture below. Extracting the arrows from the wounds, and dividing her dress among the soldiers, then tenderly wrapping her in a winding sheet, Mr. Kelly had the sad satisfaction of smoothing the earth on the unconscious breast that had ceased to suffer, and when this duty was performed, they left the little grave all alone, far from the happy home of her childhood and the brothers, with whom she had played in her innocent joy. Of all strange and terrible fates, no one who had seen her gentle face in its loving sweetness, the joy and comfort of our hearts, would have predicted such a barbarous fate for her. But it was only the passage from death into life, from darkness into daylight, from doubt and fear into endless love and joy. Those little ones, whose spirits float upward from their downy pillows, amid the tears and prayers of broken-hearted friends, are blessed to enter in at heaven's shining gate, which lies as near little Mary's rocky, blood-stained pillow in the desolate waste as the palace of a king, and when she had once gained the great and unspeakable bliss of heaven, it must have blotted out the remembrance of the pain that won it, and made no price too great for such a delight. In the far-off land of Indian homes, where western winds fan hills of black, mid lovely flowers and golden scenes, they laid our loved one down to rest. Where brightest birds, with silvery wings, sing their sweet songs upon her grave, and the moonbeams soft and pearly beams with prairie grasses o'er it wave. No simple stone e'er marks the spot where Mary sleeps in dreamless sleep, but the moaning wind, with mournful sound, doth nightly o'er it vigils keep. The careless tread of savage feet and the weary travellers pass it by, nor heed they her, who came so far, in her youth and innocence to die. But her happy spirit soared away to blissful climes above. She found sweet rest and endless joy in her bright home of love. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. What occurred at Fort Laramie after my capture. Efforts to rescue. Lieutenant Brown killed. Reward offered. It is the means of restoring another white woman and child. Her rescuers hung for former murders. A letter announcing my safe arrival at Fort Sully. Immediately after Mr. Kelly reached Deer Creek, at the time of our capture, he telegraphed to Fort Laramie of the outbreak of the Indians, and the capture of his wife. Colonel Collins, of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, commandant of the military district, ordered 2 companies, under Captain Schumann and Captain Marshall, 2 brave and daring men, to pursue and rescue me, and chastise the savages in case of resistance. But the distance of 100 miles lay between these forts, and they only arrived on their way too late for rescue. They continued their march, however, and after an absence of 3 days returned unsuccessful. Sad to relate, a young and daring officer, Lieutenant Brown, of the 11th Ohio Volunteers, fell a victim to savage cruelty in my behalf, for with a view of prospecting the neighborhood, he, with Mr. Kelly, left the main body with a small squad of men in quest of the Indians. Coming suddenly upon a band of warriors in their encampment, the brave lieutenant indiscreetly ordered an attack, but the men, seeing the futility of opposing such numbers, fled, and left Mr. Kelly and the officer. Becoming conscious of his dangerous situation, he feigned friendship, addressing them in the usual way, "How koda," which means, "How do you do, friend?" But they were not to be deceived, and sent an arrow, causing him to fall from his horse, and the effects of which caused his death a few hours afterward. He was immediately reported dead, and with all the speed the men could command they pursued his murderers, but the fresher horses of the savages carried them off beyond their reach, and the soldiers were compelled to return in disappointment. Brave young man! The ardent friend of Mr. Kelly, and the husband and father of an affectionate wife and child, stricken down in his early manhood, we would humbly lay the wreath of immortelles upon thy lonely grave. After several expeditions in like manner which proved unsuccessful, Mr. Kelly offered a reward of 19 horses, the money value of which was deposited with the commander of Fort Laramie, and it was circulated through all the Indian villages, that upon my safe delivery the reward would be paid. Every effort possible was made by my husband and his brothers to procure my rescue or ransom. No money or efforts were spared, and the long days of agonizing suspense to them were worse than death. The reward which had been offered for my ransom was the means of rescuing another white woman, a Mrs. Eubanks, and her child, held by the Indians. The Indian Two-Face and his son, having a desire to enhance their fortunes, paid a few small sums to the other Indians who claimed her, and, taking her with them, set out for Fort Laramie. When they arrived within a few miles of the fort, the prisoners were left with the son and some others, while Two-Face preceded them to arrange the terms of sale. The commander agreed to the price, and on the following day Mrs. Eubanks and her child were brought in, the Indians thinking it made no difference which white woman it was. This was several months after my capture. Instead of paying the price, the commandant seized and confined them in the guardhouse, to await trial for the murder of the ranchmen and the stealing of women and children. The testimony of Mrs. Eubanks was proof sufficient. They confessed their crimes, and were executed in May following. In crossing the North Platte River, 5 miles below the fort, Mrs. Eubanks had suffered intensely, her child being bound to her back, and she holding on to a log bound by a rope fastened to the saddle of the Indian's horse. The chief passed over easily, but mother and child were nearly frozen to death by clinging and struggling among masses of broken ice, and protected only by a thin, light garment. Mr. Kelly sent deputations of Indians with horses to the Indian villages, with letters to me, which were never delivered. They were not true to their trust, but would come to see me without giving me the messages, then return with the declaration that I could not be found. He would furnish a complete outfit for an Indian, costing about $400, and send him to find me, but the Indian cared only for the money; he would never return. Having despaired of accomplishing anything further toward my rescue at Fort Laramie, he left for Leavenworth, to obtain help from citizens there, to get permission of the commander of the division to raise an independent company for my release. There he met with his brother, General Kelly, who had just returned from the South, and had received a letter from me acquainting him with my freedom. Mr. Kelly would not at first be convinced, but, after being shown the letter, he said, "Yes, I know that is Fanny's writing, but it cannot be possible," and by daylight he was on his way to Dakota. Who can tell his varied emotions during that long and wearisome journey, when, at the end, hope held out to him the cup of joy, which, after the long suffering of months, he was about to drink? Let only those judge who have been separated from the dearest on earth, and whose fate was involved in mysterious silence more painful than if the pallid face rested beneath the coffin lid. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Supper in honor of our reunion. Departure from Fort Sully. Incidents by the way. Arrival at Geneva. Mother and child. A happy meeting. Fort Sully was garrisoned by 3 companies of the 6th Iowa Cavalry, and I should be recreant to every sense of justice did I not more particularly express my gratitude to them all, officers and men, for the delicate, more than brotherly, kindness shown me during my stay of 2 months among them. They had fought gallantly during that summer, and punished severely the Indians who held me captive; and though my sufferings at the time were increased tenfold thereby, I believe the destitute condition of the Indians had much to do with my final restoration to freedom. Had there been plenty of food in the Indian villages, none would have gone to Fort Sully to make a treaty. On each of the 2 evenings we remained at the fort after my husband's arrival, we were honored with a feast, in marked contrast with those I had attended while with the savages. Stewed oysters relished better than stewed dog, and the abundance of other good things, with the happy-looking, kind, sympathetic faces of my own people around the board, filled me with a feeling of almost heavenly content. Mr. Harry Chatterton presided at the first, and in a feeling manner expressed the delight and satisfaction of his comrades and himself experienced in this hour of our reunion. "Sweet is this dream, divinely sweet, no dream, no fancy, that you meet. Though silent grief has shadowed o'er to crush your love, it had no power. Though long divided, you've met once more to tell your toils and troubles o'er. Renew the pledge of other days, and walk in sweet and pleasant ways. May the good Father of mercies ever protect and bless you. May the sun of happiness to brightly shine upon you, and may it never again be dimmed by stern misfortune, is the earnest and heartfelt wish of every person in this fort today." With deep emotion these words were spoken, and we felt convinced they were from the innermost depths of the heart. How many affectionate, generous natures are among us, whom we can never appreciate until some heavy cloud drops down upon us, and they, with their cheerful words and kind acts, assist us to rise, and in hours of joy they are ready to grasp us by the hand, and welcome us to happiness. Anxious for a reunion with our friends, and to be once more with my dear mother, we bade farewell to those who had shown us so much kindness and attention, and commenced our journey at daylight, to prevent the Indians, many of whom remained about the fort, knowing of my departure, as I was in constant dread of recapture. Fort Sully is on the Missouri River, 300 miles from Sioux City, by land, which distance we traveled in an ambulance. At all the military posts, stations, and towns through which we passed, all, military and civilians, seemed to vie with each other in kindness and attention. Those living in frontier towns know what the nature of the Indian is, and could most heartily sympathize with one who had suffered from captivity among them. At Yankton I received particularly kind attention from Mrs. Ashe, of the Ashe Hotel, who also gave me the information, elsewhere written, of the fate of Mrs. Dooley and Mrs. Wright. Here also I met a number of the 6th Iowa Cavalry, to which gallant regiment I was under so great obligation. Dr. Bardwell, a surgeon of that regiment, who was at Fort Sully at the time the Blackfeet came in to make a treaty, and were sent off after me, and who, I had previously been informed, was active in measures tending to my release, was stationed at Yankton, and manifested the kindness of his heart in many ways. At Sioux City, Council Bluffs, and St. Joe, crowds of visitors flocked to see the white woman who had been a captive with the Indians, and I was compelled to answer many questions. From St. Joe we made all haste for Leavenworth, Kansas, where I was received by friends and relatives as one risen from the dead. At last we reached our old home in Geneva. The home from which we had departed but a few months before, lured to new fields by the brightest hopes of future prosperity. Alas, what disappointments had fallen to our lot! But soon I was clasped in my dear mother's arms, and all my sorrows were swallowed up in the joy of that reunion. On the morning of our departure for the plains, she said, while tears of sorrow filled her eyes, that she felt as though it was our final farewell. Her fears were agonizing on my behalf. She seemed to have a presentiment of evil. A dark, portentous cloud hung over my head, she felt, and would burst upon me and scatter dismay and grief, which too well was realized in the days that followed. I endeavored to cheer her with hope, and smilingly assured her that, as soon as the Pacific Railroad was completed, I should visit my home and her, and, though many miles might separate us, we still would be one in heart; and the facilities for traveling were becoming so easy and rapid, we could not be separated for any great length of time. but her sad heart refused to be comforted. A mother's unchanging love, stronger than death, faithful under every circumstance, and clinging with tenacity to the child of her affection, could not part with me without a pang of anguish, which was increased tenfold when the news of my capture reached her. Gradually she sank under this heavy affliction. Health rapidly gave way, and for 3 long months she lay helpless, moaning and bewailing the loss of her children; for, scarcely had she aroused from the terrible stupor and grief which the news of my brother's death from poison, while a soldier in the Union army, had plunged her, when this new and awful sorrow came like a whirlwind upon her fainting spirit. But God is good. In his great mercy he spared us both to meet once more, and a letter from my hand, telling her of my safety, reached her in due time, and in each other's fond embrace we were once more folded. Oh, happy hour! Methinks the angels smiled in their celestial abodes when they witnessed that dear mother's joy. The reader naturally supposes that here my narrative ought to end; that, restored to husband, mother, and friends, my season of sorrow must be over. But not so. Other trials were in store for me, and, even fortified as I was by past tribulation, I sank almost despairingly under their affliction. Nor was I yet done with the Indians. Anxious to again establish a home, we left Geneva, went to Shawneetown, where we prospered; but better prospects offering farther west, we went to Ellsworth, a new town just staked out on the western line of Kansas. I was the first woman who located there. We lived in our wagon for a time, then built a hotel, and were prospering, when fears of the Indians again harassed us. The troops at Fort Harker, 4 miles east of Ellsworth, had been out, under General Hancock, in pursuit of the Indians, to punish them for murders and depredations committed along the line of the Pacific Railroad, and coming upon an Indian camp, destroyed it, inflicting a severe chastisement. This we knew would so exasperate the Indians as to render the situation of the exposed settlements one of great danger; and after my experience, a terrible dread of again falling into their hands intensified my apprehensions for our safety. The scouts, Jack Harvey and Wild Bill, were constantly on the lookout, and eagerly would we look toward the hills for any one who could give us news, and gather around them when they came from the front, with anxious faces and listening ears. Meantime, the population of Ellsworth had rapidly increased, and military companies were formed for protection. Thus we lived in a continual state of alarm, until at last one night the signal was given that the Indians were approaching, when every man flew to his post, and the women and children fled to the places of refuge that had been prepared for them, an iron-clad house and a dugout, or place underground. I fled to the latter place, where about 50 altogether had congregated, and among them were 3 young men who were the sole survivors of a large family, father, mother, and 2 sisters, murdered and horribly mutilated in the Minnesota massacres. The Indians were repulsed, but they continued to harass us and threaten the town, so that it became necessary to apply for military protection. Accordingly, a number of colored troops were sent there, which imparted a feeling of security. But Ellsworth was doomed to a more terrible scourge, if possible, than the Indians had threatened to be. The troops were recently from the South. Soon after their arrival among us, the cholera broke out among them, and, spreading among the citizens, created a terrible panic. The pestilence was most destructive, sweeping before it old and young, and of all classes. My husband fell a victim to the disease. On the 28th day of July, 1867, a violent attack of this terrible disease carried him off, and, in the midst of peril and cares, I was left a mourning, desolate widow. Being in delicate health, I was forced to flee to the East, and stopped at St. George, where 1 week after my little one was ushered into this world of sorrow. The people were panic-stricken in relation to the cholera, and when I went there, they were afraid to receive me into their homes, Consequently, I repaired to a small cabin in the outskirts of the town, and my adopted son and myself remained there alone for several days. A young lady, Miss Baker, called on me in great sympathy, saying she was not afraid of cholera, and would stay with me until after my confinement. I was very thankful for her kindness, and after the fear was over with the people, every attention that humanity could suggest was given me. But alas! my heart was at home, and so deep were my yearnings, the physician declared it impossible for me to recover until I did go home. The events that had transpired seemed like a fearful dream. The physician who attended me went to Ellsworth to see if it was prudent for me to go, sending a letter immediately after, bidding me come, as the cholera had disappeared. Oh, how changed was that home! The voice that had ever been as low, sweet music to my ear was hushed forever. The eye that had always met mine with smiling fondness was closed to light and me, and the hand so often grasped in tender love was palsied in death. Mr. Kelly, the noble, true, and devoted husband, my loved companion, the father of my innocent child, was gone. Oh, how sad that word! My heart was overwhelmed with grief, and that did its work, for it prostrated me on a bed of illness nigh unto death. Dr. McKennon very faithfully attended me during my illness, and as I was recovering, he was seized by severe sickness himself, which proved fatal. He was anxious to see me before he died, and desired assistance that he might be taken down stairs for the purpose. His attendants allowed him to do so, but he fainted in the attempt, and was laid on the floor until he recovered, then raised and placed on the sofa. I was then led into the room, and, seating myself beside him, he grasped my hand, exclaiming, "My friend, do not leave me. I have a brother in New York." But his lips soon stiffened in death, and he was unable to utter more. It was a severe shock to my nervous system, already prostrated by trouble and illness, and I greatly missed his attention and care. No relative or friend was near by to lay his weary head upon the pillow, but we laid him to rest in the burial ground of Ellsworth with sad hearts and great emotion. In the spring I went to the end of the road further west with an excursion party, to a place called Sheridan. On our return we stopped at Fort Hays, where I met two Indians who recognized me, and I also knew them. We conversed together. I learned that they had a camp in the vicinity, and they were skulking around, reconnoitering. They were well treated here, and very liberally dealt with. They inquired where I lived. I told them way off, near to the rising sun. The next morning, when the train left town, the band, riding on horseback, jumped the ditch, and looked into the windows of the cars, hoping to see me. They told the people that I belonged to them, and they would take my papoose and me way off to their own country. We were their property, and must go with them. It was supposed that if I had been in the cars, the Indians would have attempted to take the train. Chapter 26.